Welcome to Technically, a webinar series dedicated to the technical challenges of making the web accessible. This month's presenter is Luis Garcia, the Senior Product Manager for Accessibility at eBay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this March edition of Technically. Thank you so much for joining us today, and say hello to the Facebook world, as you may have seen through the sharing that we are currently live streaming from our Tenon page. This month we have Luis Garcia, Senior Product Manager for Accessibility at eBay, and he'll be talking about the various color-related guidelines in WCAG and how fixing one issue might just create issues in other parts of the page. And as always, we'll be answering questions at the end. So you can, of course, put them in the chat box beforehand, but we'll get to those when Luis is done with his presentation. So without further ado, take it away.
So, hey, everybody. Thanks for coming out or signing up. We're going to be talking today about color alone, color contrast, color conflicts, all sorts of fun stuff that can happen when you're doing color stuff with WCAG. So before we get started, I have the slide deck URL for anybody that wants to follow along at home on your personal device. The URL is garcialo.com/2019/technically, spelled like the webinar. So the URL again is garcialo.com/2019/TECHNICA11Y. And as I was introduced, I'm Luis Garcia. I'm a Senior Product Manager for Accessibility at eBay. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at Garcialo. Let's go ahead and get started. So a real quick overview of what we're going to be talking about. For the last few years, I've been giving a talk where I explore exceptions to the WCAG success criteria. And when I cover color-related things, I show these two examples. So there's two sentences. The first one says, somewhere in the sentence is a link that fails 1.4.1, which is the use of color guideline or the color alone guideline. And the thing with this one is that the word sentence is a link, and at least to me, it's pretty clearly, I can tell that that blue is a link. And then I have a following sentence, which says somewhere in this sentence is a link that passes 1.4.1. So in this sentence, the word sentence is also a link, but it's a little bit less noticeable to me that it's a link, right? So it's just kind of like, there are already some kind of like weird things going on with the contrast and the algorithm that we use for calculating the sufficient contrast for colors. And I would also say things like, I kind of hate the color alone success criteria. The color contrast algorithm doesn't always work, as we see in the example above, but it's what we have available to us. The only difference between nothing and text is color in the shape of letters. And I'd say things like, I'm going to make a talk about how much I hate the color alone guideline. And I've also encountered many things from wonderful people I've worked with, and designers, developers, people trying to meet like the letter of WCAG, but not necessarily the spirit. So this isn't like a nice talk that's gonna make you feel like all pepped up and gung-ho about accessibility. It's not about like gotchas, like, oh, when you use color, look out for this and work through that this way. It's kind of more of a warning of some things that people might want to try to get away with, so you can be prepared to say no. If they say like, well, this technically passes, you can be like, yeah, that does kind of technically pass, but we really should not be doing that. We'll go ahead and look at our agenda. So as the title of the talk suggests, we're going to be looking at color alone, we're looking at color contrast, and then we're going to be looking at the color conflicts. And so color conflicts, in this case, isn't necessarily like where things butt heads. It kind of is, but it's kind of just like things that aren't completely clear from the guidelines that are given to us, like what should you do, or there's not enough guidance for like, how to make a judgment call. But first, let's cover the guidelines to see what exactly we're talking about, because I'm sure not everybody here is, on the same page as far as, like there's people that are new, there's people that have been here for a while doing accessibility. So we just want to make sure that we're covering the basics. So the color alone, or the use of color guideline, 141 in WCAG, says color is not used as the only visual means of conveying information. indicating an action, prompting a response, or distinguishing a visual element. And this affects users with low vision. This affects users with various types of color blindness. And a note on that is that when we're considering use of color, we want to make sure that we're including all types of color blindness. So I've seen several times where designers they're trying to do the right thing, and they're like, oh, we're going to choose these colors because they work with people that have like red-green color blindness because that's the most common type of color blindness. It's like, well, yeah, that's good, and I applaud that effort. But just as people working in the accessibility industry, we're representing people that have disabilities and are typically like a small percentage of the population. So just as we're advocating for people, we're saying these people that are a small percentage, they're a protected class, they need to have representation. So just as we're saying that, we should also within that group, not discriminate against people that might have a more rare type of color blindness or a rare combination of disabilities, right? We want to make sure we're completely inclusive and that we're considering all the way down to the smallest populations, including people that might have grayscale kind of vision. So just doing stuff for people that have like red-green color blindness, that's not really going to be enough. All right, I'll kind of stop kind of diverting from that, and we'll go ahead and just take a look at some of the common ways that people will fail use of color. So one of the most common ways is input errors, right? So if you have, so I have two inputs on this screen. So one of them is a normal state, right? So you have a first name field with a text input, and then we have another text input for last name, and that one, the text is in red, and the outline of the input is in red to show that this is in an error state, right? And that's typically how this ones get failed, because people will just change the color or something, using color alone to indicate the error status. It's obviously an issue. We might have charts and graphs where we're linking the data that's in the legend with the data that's presented in the bar chart or in our graph using only color, right? So the example I have is I have some no actual values here, just kind of some rectangles that represent bar charts, a bar chart. And then there's a legend for lions, tigers, and bears. And then there's, the only association between the two is the colors. And then we have the classic one, links in a sentence. And this one is simplified as links in a sentence, but it's really color alone that's used to indicate the interactive text, to indicate the interactive text when in the same context as non-interactive text. So it basically means that in the same space, you have things that are interactive, things that are non-interactive, and we're using color to show what's interactive. And this typically occurs in sentences and paragraphs, but it also happens in lists and in tables. And so let me just show you these examples. So in the sentence, it says somewhere in the sentence is a link that fails use of color, and the words a link are in blue. And right, so the only things that are blue are a link, and then everything else is kind of like the typical like black color. But this also occurs in a list, right? So you have, in this list, I have 3 list items: first list item, second list item, and third list item. The second list item is in blue. The first and third, are in black. So that's, the blue is there to indicate that's a link. That's another way that we can fail it in the context of a list. And then finally, links in a table. So I have a 3x3 table with different types of pies. So I have, the columns are pie flavor, sale price, and normal price. And then going down the rows, I have different types of pie. So I have an apple pie, a pumpkin pie, and a key lime pie. All very delicious pies, but in this chart, they have different prices. So the prices that I have underneath the sale price column are all linked, and all the ones that are in the normal price column are not linked. However, they have basically the same visual styling, with the exception that the ones that are links are in blue, right? So this is a place where we would want to do something in addition to avoid failing the use of color guideline. So what are some things that we can use to make sure that we're not using color alone? So some of the things that we can use are going to be text. where we just provide a little bit more information via text. We're a little bit more verbose. We can provide underlines. We can use patterns, shapes, and icons, right, for things like for charts and graphs. We can use a position of content. We can use brightness or luminance, right? That's a 3:1 contrast ratio. And then we can use other text styling like bolding, italicizing, and changing the size of our text. So here's some examples, kind of looking back at the examples we just looked at, but giving them a little bit more context, a little bit more information to avoid just using color alone. So I took that last name error field from before, and I just added some text into the label. It says, please provide a last name, right? It's probably not the best error message, but it's basically some text showing how we can provide the information that there's an error state that's using more than just the color, right? And then same thing, we have, or similarly, we have underline for a link in a sentence, right? So the link is underlined. We have a sentence where the word link is underlined, and it's also blue, right? So we're not just using the color, we're also using some text formatting. And continuing with that, we can use other types of text formatting, such as bold. So I have another sentence that says the link is emboldened, where the word link is a link, it's blue, and it's in bold, right? Making it visually distinct from the non-text content in the sentence. However, if you plan to emphasize content on your site, then you're back to having the same issue. So, and that issue kind of happens with underline as well, right? If you're using underlines to distinguish links, or if you're using bold to distinguish links, then make sure that on the same page in the same contexts, you're not using that styling to mean something else, because otherwise you're back where you started, and you're back to having color alone being used as the only means of conveying that information. Then I have the charts again, but now I've put some friendly little shapes inside of them. So inside of the first bar, there's a square, second one has a circle, third one has a triangle. And in the legend, the bullet points for the 3 data points, lions, tigers, and bears, each correspond to a shape. So now we're using some shapes in addition to the color to associate the content from the in the bar chart to the content in the legend. All right, so let's take a look at where we're at in the story of this webinar. So we've completed color alone, kind of got an idea of how that works. Next, we're going to look at color contrast. Then we're going to get to the color conflicts. All right, so for the color contrast, we're going to ignore the AAA guideline because most people don't use that. And we're only going to look at the 2 contrast success criteria at the AA level. So that's going to be contrast minimum, or as I'm going to say, text contrast. And then we're going to look at the new non-text contrast guideline from WCAG 2.1. So for text contrast, this one's it's fairly straightforward. It applies to text and images of text, and any text or images of text need to have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1, with some exceptions. So if we have larger text, that can have a 3 to 1 contrast ratio, right? So slightly lower contrast requirements. Inactive UI components are exempt from that contrast minimum. Similarly, decorative content, invisible content, incidental texts, those are also exempt. And logos, those are also exempt from the contrast minimums. And a side note about text contrast is that there aren't any contrast maximums defined in WCAG. This is important to note because for some people, dyslexia, reading black text on white, something like a really high contrast can actually cause pain for them, right? So we don't want to make sure. So if you're looking at the webinar, you can see that the text I have it's black, but it's kind of like an off black. And then my background isn't white. It's kind of like, it's a creamy kind of off-white color. So that's there to not have like such a stark contrast between, the background color and the foreground color. Oh, and another note, don't neglect your image alt text when you're considering text contrast, right? So if your images fail to load on your page, you want to make sure that everybody can read your the alt text that shows up in place of your images. And yes, you can style alt text. And if you're following along at home, you can click through that link and see generally how you would do that. All right, so text contrast clarifications. So if you have much larger text, that doesn't mean you can go below the 3:1 contrast ratio. I've had some people ask me that, like, well, what if we make our text much bigger? Like, how much slower can we go below the 3:1? It's like, well, under WCAG, it doesn't really have any have an avenue for you to do that. So 3:1 is, no matter how large a text is, even if it's like up on a billboard or something, or it's like on the the Jumbotron, 3:1 is the lowest contrast ratio that's allowed in WCAG. And we have the logo exemption, right, for like branding kind of stuff of the logos, but that doesn't really extend to brand colors. So I learned that lesson when I was, so people that have been working in accessibility, or if you've done stuff related to contrast and trying to make the colors work, you'll know that orange, yellow, some of those colors are kind of hard to, make work against white or against black. And so when I was at UT Austin, our website, we had, for those who don't know, the colors for UT Austin are, burnt orange and white. And so we had on our website, like all of our links are orange. So that was difficult because, making that orange, finding an orange that worked was a bit of a challenge, but we were able to get it done. We were able to get our branding people on board to find an orange that was burnt enough for them, or burnt enough for us, but not too brown not too burnt that it looked brown. So the exemption doesn't apply to brand colors, just for the logos. And low contrast is often used as an affordance for disabled content, so which means that that's kind of a visual cue to users that if something has a low contrast and typically in gray, that's going to mean that the control or the element or that section of content is disabled. And the last bit of clarification is the success criteria for text contrast actually says that the inactive UI components are exempt from the contrast minimum, but really it's equivalent to being disabled in HTML or unavailable for user interaction, right? So the differentiation there between inactive and disabled is basically the difference between having, let's say, a submit button at the end of a form that will only, become available for the user to use after you've completed, the required fields, for instance. So I would say that that's disabled because in HTML we would, we'd put the keyword disabled on that input, which means it would be unavailable for users to interact with. However, inactive just means that the user can interact with it, but it's not currently what's active. So a good example for that would be if you have a tab list, like a group of tabs, you can switch between the different tabs. So the one that's active is the one that you're on, but then all those tabs you could go to, those are inactive, right? So it's that's generally the way that I think of the difference between inactive and disabled. In WCAG, they still kind of use inactive and disabled in a similar way, but just so you know, that's what I mean when I use those two words. And I would say the inactive content, such as the additional tabs you might want to click on, I think those should meet the contrast minimums, because how are you going to know which tab you want to go to if you can't read the content? All right, so moving on to non-text contrast. So this is a newer guideline introduced in WCAG 2.1, and this one basically says that UI components and graphical objects that are needed to communicate information or functionality have a contrast ratio of at least 3:1. So some clarifications on non-text color contrast clarifications. So some clarifications on non-text contrast. So if you have text in your UI components and your graphics, those remain text and are still held to the standards for the text contrast, right? So if you have regular text inside of your button, that's going to be, the text itself would still need to meet the 4.5:1 contrast ratio if it's normal text, And it can be 3:1 if it's larger text. And then logos are still exempt. So if it's a logo in your graphic, it's still going to, still exempt from the contrast minimums. Another thing is that non-text contrast does not always require the component boundaries to meet the contrast minimums. It also does not always compare the contrast between the component itself or the graphic itself to the background, right? So when we do text contrast, we're always comparing, the color of the text to the background of that, to the color of the background of that text. So that's not always the case with non-text contrast, and we'll look at some examples in just a second. Lastly, it does not require that different states of the same component need to have a sufficient contrast minimum met, unless they're next to each other. And we'll actually go a little bit more into detail into that a little bit later on. So when do I check for contrast? Generally, it's what is required to identify the component and its state, right? So if there's information about a control that's needed to tell that it's a component or that it's like interactive, or like what the state of something is, that's when we want to make sure that we're checking for the contrast. And then to identify the part or parts of the graphic that are important, to understand what that graphic is. Let's just take a look. Let's just take a look at some examples that are in the guideline itself. So this is the I have this in reading view. This is the 1.4.11 non-text contrast. So here's an example of how it's saying that we're not always going to have the boundaries of the interactive controls need to be specified, right? So both of these examples would pass, assuming the colors meet the contrast minimums. So button here on the left doesn't have a border; it's just a text button, but here on the right side we have the word button in the center of a button, and we have some styling for the border. In this case, the left one would pass because the text button, which is all it's kind of needed to let the user know that this is a button, that this is actionable, that's going to meet the contrast minimum for text 4.5:1. And then similarly on the right side, even if this boundary that's around the word button fails to meet the 3:1 contrast ratio, the word button itself could pass because it's 4.5:1, right? So it doesn't necessarily, the entire button wouldn't necessarily need to meet that ratio. And then this next example, they're a little apart. So we have this name input up here at the top, and then we have this name input here at the bottom. And these are kind of both examples of how we're not always comparing the text, we're not always comparing the color of the component with the background. Sometimes we're going to be comparing the component with itself or some other part of the component with the background, right? So this top example, so we have name is in a dark color, and then there's a white background behind the entire, the page background is going to be a white, and then the input field is kind of like a silver gray box boundary around the box. And so in this case, right, the thing that we would use to check the contrast for this non-text content is going to be the boundary box or the border, and check the contrast of that against the background of the page. That's how we're identifying what this input is. However, this one down here is pretty much the same thing. The name is in white instead of in black because we have a dark background for the page. But basically the box is probably the same silver gray color. But if we compared that gray color to the dark blue background, it probably wouldn't meet the contrast minimum. However, in this case, we can use the inner background of the text input and the text input and compare that to the background dark blue, and that will meet the contrast minimum. Right? So it's not always that we're going to be comparing the entirety, the component in its entirety with the background. Here's another example where we're comparing the contrast of elements within the component itself instead of worrying about the background, right? So this is it's a kind of gray checkbox in with the rest of the background of the component is a purple color. So we're comparing, the components of the checkbox itself, the checkbox or the checked state, so the check mark, and then the purple background. That's what we're doing a comparison of those two colors, not of the purple and the background how it is on the page, right? I'll just look at, let's see, look at two more examples just to kind of give you an idea of some of the principles around this. And then we'll move on to the next section, which is going to be a lot of fun. All right, so this group shows some radio buttons. It's 4 different radio buttons in different presentation styles. So the first one's not selected. It's just like a circle with has no filling side of it. The second one is a circle that has it's selected, so all the rest of them are selected. But the first one that's selected has a complete fill within the border that's been specified for it. The third one is more of a flat design where it's completely filled, but the fill is kind of like the same color as the border, or it's a fill without a border. And then the last one, has the border of the radio button, and then there's a fill inside of it to let you know it's selected, but it doesn't fill up the entirety of the radio button. So there's a little bit of an inner kind of border, like there's like a border, and then there's some spacing between the border and the selected area fill. So in the second and third examples, what we would be doing for checking the contrast is we would check the contrast of the fill in the second example with the background color. In the third one, the flat design, the only color that we have really is the fill. So we'd compare the fill with the background color. But in the last one, what we'd probably do is, compare the fill color with the inner background color of the input, right? So this gray fill with this like little white border kind of, in between the border and the fill. This last example that we're going to look at kind of, twisted my brain a bit first time I looked at it. So there's 4 different types of star ratings presented. The first 2 will pass, and the last 2 will fail. Okay, so these 2 at the top, they pass. The bottom 2 fail. The rationale behind each of these is pretty straightforward once you kind of look at this for a little bit, and you read a little bit. So the first 2, well, the first of the star rating examples, it has 5 stars, possible 5 stars, but the ranking that's been given is 2 out of 5 stars. So the first 2 stars that are the ones that are filled in, they're completely filled in, they're black, and then the remaining 3 stars that aren't selected, they have just the outline, right? So the thing that we're comparing here is the how do we distinguish between the stars that are in one state versus another? Is we're going to compare the contrast of the content of the fill versus the the not filled state for the non-selected stars, and that's going to be a sufficient contrast ratio between this black and then this inner background color. And then for the second one, right? So if we look at the same, if we kind of compare the same thing, right? We have same situation that there are 2 out of 5 stars selected. If we look at the fill of the 2 stars that are selected and compare it to the fill of the 3 that aren't selected, that's not going to meet that contrast minimum. That yellow against that white, that's not going to work. So then how does this pass? Well, if we look at the border, we can see that this has a thicker border than those remaining stars. So that's how it passes, right? So it's not just comparing, this one aspect of it. It's looking at the entirety of it and seeing if there is a way that we can distinguish, these 2 stars from these other 3 stars. In my personal opinion, this isn't really super clear. That this is like I guess I'm just not as good as seeing like some things are bold and some things aren't when it comes to graphics. But this is sufficient according to WCAG. And if we look at these latter 2 examples that both fail, the first of them that fail is pretty similar to that last one that worked. So we have, the 2 stars are filled in with yellow, the remaining stars are unselected, have no fill. But in this case, we don't have a thicker border that we can use to delineate, right? So actually, yeah, now that I look at it a little closer, right? So I can see clearly when comparing this one with the one above it, it's like, yeah, this one definitely doesn't have this thicker border on these two stars. So these are going to be, the only difference between this and that one is color, and the contrast isn't sufficient enough to distinguish them. That said, one of the things that we can use is like brightness or luminance, which is that's defined as like a 3-to-1 contrast ratio. So if we were using a different color, then we could potentially, have this one work, right? So we are using a darker color in the first example, right, where we had the black, so the black against the white. Okay, so the position guidelines or the position conflicts is basically that. So we have some navigation links up here, and we're using positioning to define that these are links, right? They're separate from the the normal content in the page. But what if we have a more subtle separation for the links at the top, right? So like this learn more on its own line. So we have this paragraph here, and then we have learn more here. It is positionally different from this content. Like learn more is always going to be on its own line at the end of a paragraph. Is that enough, position separation to say that, nothing else is required? What if learn more is more separate? Is that going to be enough? Like we put it further down, right? We put more space between the text that has a similar treatment and the learn more. Is that going to be enough? That's a little bugbear. We don't really have guidance in the guidelines to let us know that. And kind of continue on, right? I've not really seen people talk too much about visited links and unvisited links. Is this a failure of use of color? The new contrast guidelines for non-text contrast says, there's not a new requirement that visited links contrast with the default color. But, does that mean that that wasn't a requirement before? Who knows? And then also, because in that same paragraph, it says that that the guideline doesn't require a change of color that differentiate between states of an individual component, that they meet the 3-to-1 contrast ratio when they don't appear next to each other. But does that does it need to meet the contrast ratio when they do appear next to each other? And then if so, like how much is next to each other, right? Like what's that differentiation? And then for disabled inputs, right? So this one meets the contrast minimum, this top text input. The bottom one doesn't meet it, but what if, if the enabled input is just above the contrast minimum, the disabled one is just below? Does it fail use of color because they're so close? Just like we have, text in a sentence that we need to make sure there's a sufficient contrast between those if we don't want to use an underline. Do we need to do something else like similarly for enabled and disabled inputs? And then similarly, right, we have these, we start getting into switches and we add a lot more states, right? It's not just enabled or disabled. There's, visual difference that are showing us whether this is on or off. And in the case of switches, right, the only one that has color is going to be enabled and on. Usually disabled is going to be gray, and then off will desaturate the colors in the control. So we have 3 states that all have different, kinds of gray. What parts do we need to differentiate, right? Both parts of the switch are needed to identify the component is a switch, right? The big bits, the big bits on the right, if it's on, the big bits on the left if it's off, and the on and off. So it's on and off is designated by the position. So does it need to meet the contrast between? Do we need to have a sufficient contrast between enabled on and disabled on to differentiate between those 2 states? And what about enabled off and disabled off, right? That's even worse because, like I said, those are all going to be in gray. And this is the last bit. So we'll run a little bit late, but we should be able to get to this. So this sentence here at the top has a link in it, right? And this is the classic case that everybody's aware of. When we have that link in this situation, it can pass if it has a 3-to-1 contrast ratio between the link and the surrounding text, and then a 4-to-5 contrast ratio between the link and its background. So the link text needs to have a 4.5 contrast ratio with its background. The surrounding text needs to also have 4.5 contrast ratio between it and its background. And then on hover and focus, we need to provide an underline or some kind of similar styling. And we're used to balancing these ratios out. It's a pretty well-known issue. But what if we have a situation like this sentence where it says, but what if the entire sentence is a link and we have some color? Does this need to meet? Like, do we need to have some kind of, like, does this fail? Like, it seems like it would technically be correct because color's being used, but there's no surrounding text for the link. And the entire thing's a link. We're just using multiple colors within this link. And then what if there's no difference in color between a link and the surrounding text? Can it fail the use of color success criterion if there's no actual use of color? I would say technically it fails. I mean, technically it passes because there's no color being used, so it can't possibly fail that. But it just seems like it's a bad idea to do these kinds of things. And so I'm not going to go and shame designers or other people who have maybe tried to get away with some of these things. I'm not going to tell you which of them are things that designers have tried getting away with, or that are just kind of like ideas that have popped into my head. But that's pretty much, some of the conflicts that can kind of come up. So, thank you for listening to me rant. Thank you for attending my talk. Any questions?
I did see one pop up in the chat earlier on. Let me get back to it. So are buttons addressed differently when they do not need a border or background to help identify them as buttons or actionable items, whereas links and content should use an underline to help identify them as links by not relying on color alone?
Yeah. What's the question?
Are buttons addressed differently, that they don't need a border or background?
So I don't think it's necessarily that buttons and links are treated differently in that way. There's this kind of, so that was another example I was thinking about putting in here, but I didn't feel too confident about it, right? Like, do we need to have some visual distinction between things that are links and things that are buttons, right? I would say that, in practice, they're treated the same way, right? That the designer is going to treat them like interactive elements, and developers, like, people know that developers are just going to go use links as buttons and use buttons as links. Like, to some developers, really just like they're interactive things, and not tied to any specific functionality. So I would like there to be, within a design system, for there to be consistency between things that are links and things that are buttons, or not between the two, but like a user should be able to differentiate what's a link and what's a button just by looking at it. But right now, the guideline probably doesn't. The guideline probably would allow you to have differentiation, or it wouldn't really matter. So you don't need to make that differentiation.
All righty. And do we have any other questions? Oh, there we go. Non-text contrast. Does the hover state of buttons have to meet the contrast ratios, or is the fact that it's in a hover state enough?
I think that they said that they don't really need to. So they would need to on their own. Actually, the hover state, probably the focus state would need to. There is a bit on it, right? So it's one of the newer guidelines. I'm not as intimately familiar with it, but I would encourage you to take a look at the guideline itself, because I'm sure it mentions it. So let's see, state. So non-text information within controls uses a change of hue alone to convey the state. That's a little different. All right, we can look through this, but basically just do some reading. Search for the word state. If the focus state relies on a change of color, changing the color, then the changing from one color to another has at least 3:1 ratio. There's going to be some content in here that's gonna, you'll be able to find your answer in here. I haven't internalized this guideline well enough to give you an answer.
Okay, so yeah, read through the WCAG guideline. I just put the chat in the URL for the tweet for the deck in the chat for anybody that wants to.
Cool, awesome.
Take a look at it again. What is the best link combination for link styling in a content management system that allows people to use bold and underline while adding content to the page. Would you have to use color bold and or underline to avoid conflicts?
Typically, I usually use underlines. So like, yeah, you could have conflicts with other text that's underlined, but since the beginning of the web, right, like underline has been the affordance given to identify links. I would just kind of like within a CMS, it gets a little bit weird because it's like, you don't necessarily want to treat every single link and have underlines for every single link. That said, right, like if you did have underlines on every single link, it's not gonna, some people will just think it looks a little bit ugly. Like if you look at mine, right, I have these navigation links down here, they're underlined. Like I don't think they look too bad. And people know that, links are underlined. By default, the browser is going to underline links. And often the guidance I give to teams when there's something that needs to be underlined is I'm saying, I don't tell them to add an underline to it. I tell them to stop removing the underline from the link that the browser puts on here. And if you get to the case where you have, like, let me just show this because I know from memory that this is a thing. So if you go to like a footer, whoop, it's all the way down here, and you have something like this where you have multiple links right next to each other, the underlines are going to give you affordance of where that link begins and ends, right? You can't just say it's going to be each word because accessibility is one word. The link is one word. User agreement, that's a 2-word link. Privacy, cookies, right? Like these are all going to, like the underline is what everybody knows as being a link.
Yeah. A follow-up question to the button answer. I know you said read the guidelines, but Michelle, if there's not a border and no background defining the button area, wouldn't it look like?
It's just going to look like text that's on the page, yeah. So it'll look like what some people would say is they'll say like, oh, that's a link. And it's like, well, no, just because it's a text doesn't mean it's a link. Because there could be, within a sentence, you might have a flyout for, for that text to give you a little bit more information about that term, right? So if you go to like Wikipedia, they now have on their links, they have like the little flyout thing that comes up, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that, if it was a toggle kind of functionality, then that would be a button. It wouldn't be a link.
Okay. All righty. And our next presentation will be on, when's that, first Wednesday in April?
It's going to be the third. Is the first Wednesday in April.
Yep, first Wednesday in April. At 11 a.m. we'll have Shell Little, who is the mobile accessibility lead at Wells Fargo. And her title of her talk is Dark Adventures in Mobile Accessibility. She's going to talk why the mobile space is so difficult to work in and give concrete examples of things that would technically pass in WCAG, but are really bad experience for users with various disabilities, with a focus on cognitive disabilities on mobile. So thank you all again for joining, and thank you to Luis, and hope to see some of you all at CSUN. Stop by the Tenon booth. Carl and I will be there, and as well as some of the other Tenon family, and we'll all see you next month. Thanks again.